Well, welcome everybody. Today is May 18th, 2021, and we are hosting a session here with a couple of experts on COVID vaccine and infectious disease to help educate the population, the school population in the state of Maine on COVID-19 vaccines as a way to increase the uptake across our state. So I'm Emily Poland. I'm with the Department of Education. I'm the school nurse consultant, and I'm here with Dr. Jenny Jubilis from Maine Medical Center and Dr. Kyle Massey from Northern Light at Eastern Maine Medical Center. And I'm just going to turn it right over to Dr. Jubilis to get us started.
All right, Kyle, if you'll go to the next slide. So first, a little disclaimer. So I'm a pediatric infectious disease physician at Maine Medical Center. We do a lot with vaccines, obviously. And Dr. Massey is an infectious disease pharmacist at Northern Light. But these reviews reflect our these slides reflect our views and not necessarily the views of Maine Med or Northern Light. And we don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose as well. Next slide. So I'm going to start out by just kind of talking about why these vaccines are necessary and why it's important for our children to get the COVID vaccine. As of today, currently they're approved for ages 12 and up under emergency use authorization. And we are actively seeking to vaccinate these kids, but hopefully they will be approved relatively soon down to even younger ages. So as of May 13th, which is the most recent data that the American Academy of Pediatrics has collated, there is a significant amount of pediatric COVID in the US. There is a belief, and in some cases it's not really a correct belief, that children don't get COVID and children don't get sick with COVID. As of May 13th, kids represent between 14 and 20% of all cases in the United States. And the rate per 100,000 children is over 5,000 cases. So that's a very significant burden of disease, and it affects kids' ability to go to school and participate in extracurricular activities and their health. And in Maine in particular, as of today, our rates, our pediatric under age 20 COVID cases make up the greatest percentage of our COVID cases, and it's approaching 20%. So it's not insignificant. And that's increased over the past 2 weeks. Nationally, it's been about a 3 to 4% increase in COVID cases. Of all comers hospitalized with COVID, only 3% are up to 3% are pediatric. So it's absolutely true that children do not get hospitalized at the same rate as adults, and especially older adults. However, we are seeing more cases in kids as we vaccinate the adults, and up to 2% of kids who get COVID are going to be hospitalized with COVID. So as we see more cases in the pediatric population, that 2% is going to be a bigger and bigger number. So there's going to be more illness and more significant disease. And there have also been about 300 total pediatric deaths nationally from COVID. And that pales in comparison to the almost 600,000 deaths now that we're approaching total, but that is still 1 every 36 hours to 1 every day, which is not, again, not insignificant, and every single one of those deaths is a tragedy. There's only 9 states, of which Maine is one, that report no childhood deaths currently, and we hope it stays that way. But again, we've watched that number of no childhood deaths, states with no childhood deaths, decrease over time, and we have had children significantly critically ill with this. In addition to what we call acute COVID, so kids who get infected and are very, very sick with their COVID, there's also this syndrome called multisystem inflammatory syndrome, which happens usually after mild cases of COVID. Sometimes kids don't even have symptoms from their COVID, and then several weeks later, they get significant inflammation throughout their body, their heart, their lungs, their kidneys, all over the place. And there's been about 3,000 cases of those nationally. Those children often require ICU admission. They have significant activity limitations where they can't do sports or gym or any sort of physical activity for months after the fact, and we really don't know what the long-range health effects are in those children. So that's, again, something important to consider. Next slide, Kyle. So there are some risk factors for severe disease in children and teenagers when you think about acute COVID infection. And it's kind of on the extremes of age and childhood. So young kids less than a year of age, and then your teenagers age 12 and up, the group that we're vaccinating right now. In addition, children who are similar to adults, children who are racial or ethnic minorities, children with chronic lung disease, including asthma, children with cardiovascular disease, and children who are immune suppressed are all at increased risk. One of the biggest risk factors in children and teenagers is obesity. And about 20% of our pediatric patients qualify as obese. So that's, again, a significant challenge and something to overcome, particularly as we get more disease in this population. In addition, there's these variants, which I'm sure many people have heard of. There's the B117 variant, which was discovered in the UK. There's the B1351 variant, which was discovered in South Africa, and the P1 variant, which has been discovered in Brazil. And there are reports that these may be more transmissible in children and also may cause more severe disease in children. Oh, next slide. So this is just an example of what COVID can do to an adolescent's lungs. So the picture with mostly, these are CAT scans of the lungs, and the picture with mostly dark is normal lungs. You like that, dark is normal. The picture with the white on my left is a COVID infected lung. So you can see that and the white is really inflammation. So you can see that there is a lot of inflammation in this COVID infected lung. And even children who get mild symptoms can have significant inflammation in their lungs. And again, we don't know what the long-term effects are of this. Next slide, please. And then I mentioned multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. And again, this is something that can happen usually about a month after a COVID infection. And many times the children don't even know that they've had COVID. Their parents don't even know they've had COVID. They've been completely without symptoms. But then they come into the hospital. And the thing that has been, I think, most shocking about this is how sick and how sick these kids get. It's in a matter of hours that they progress from having fevers to having inflammation around their heart. We've had children whose heart function has fallen to about 20% of its normal level over a matter of hours, who've been on multiple medications to keep their blood pressure up so they don't go into shock. Some children end up requiring heart-lung bypass because their hearts are performing so poorly. And about half of kids who get this end up in the intensive care unit. So it's significant. And these are just some pictures of what you see kind of in the child, where things get swollen and red, and their eyes are red, and similarly their hearts are swollen as well. And long term, we don't know exactly what's going to happen to these children. This is very similar to another inflammatory process we have that we do know about, where kids can get coronary artery aneurysms, swelling of the arteries around the heart. And that particular syndrome is called Kawasaki's disease. And those children, if they're not treated with anti-inflammatories, can have heart attacks further down the line in their 20s or 30s. And we don't know if that's what's going to happen to these children. We're trying to treat this as if it is Kawasaki disease. So it's very unclear what the long-term complications are. Next slide, please. So kind of to conclude, I would say that children should get vaccinated because in addition to stopping the spread, they can get sick. Not as often as adults, but they can get sick. And even if they have mild COVID, they can get pretty significant disease down the line. So that brings us to kind of the safety of the vaccine and how it was developed. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Massey to talk about that.
Thank you, Dr. Jubilis. Yes, and certainly there's plenty of good reasons out there why we should be looking to vaccinate our pediatric population. But there's also a lot of anxiety around that's understandable. Certainly plenty of anxiety initially when it was the adults being vaccinated, but then when we think about whether or not to use these vaccines in our children, these questions feel compounded. So I want to go through a few of the common questions that I get and try to provide a little bit of background and information that might help to alleviate some of that anxiety. Yeah, so first, one of the biggest questions I get is, were the vaccines rushed? Did we move too quickly to get these approved and out there? So to answer this question, I typically go through the normal timeline for vaccine approval. So here I'm going to represent that with some graphics. But for vaccine approval, traditionally you start with identifying a target that you want to go after with a vaccine. This is done in animal studies and in laboratories. And usually companies start with a whole ton of targets and work through those one by one. And when they identify candidates that make sense, that seem to trigger the immune response that they're looking for, then they start to move into human trials. These are largely very expensive. Early trials, not as expensive as human trials, but still very costly, and typically go through quite a number of iterations before they get to a vaccine candidate. So one of the great pieces of some of the programs that are out there to support vaccine development is helping to subsidize this part of the cost for companies developing vaccines so that they can say, from a financial standpoint, at least I can get moving through this part and identify things that are obviously safe and start trialing those to make sure that they're effective without as much of a concern for the financial impact there. And not every drug company out there has utilized the available incentives. Some have and some haven't, and that's helped to support the diversity of vaccines that are in development. And so that piece usually takes about 1 to 10 years. Quite a bit of work goes into it. And then when we move into the human phases of the trial, there's 3 typical parts to it. They start out with a few small healthy volunteers, move on to a slightly larger group of volunteers who are at risk for or have the disease of interest. And usually around this time, they start the manufacturing process for enough drug to at least support the trials. At this point, they don't know if that drug is going to go to market, and they don't want to overinvest in the infrastructure if it doesn't ultimately make it there. And often they don't make it through these trials from an efficacy standpoint. And then once that first and second phase of trials are done in the humans, they move on to these large multi-center, multinational trials with thousands and thousands of volunteers. And these are the ones that you're hearing about in the news from Pfizer and Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, et cetera. And this is when they really start to invest their money into the manufacturing pathways to produce enough to actually go to market. Once these 3 phases of trials are completed, they use that to submit to the FDA a package to say, hey, we'd like to take this out to the public. And the FDA reviews that and either approves it or doesn't. Once it's approved, it goes out to market and starts to be used in the general population. And this piece usually takes 1 to 5 years. So here you're at a minimum of 2 up to 16 plus years to develop a vaccine. Now, once they are approved in the adults, that's when usually we start pediatric trials. Once they're safe and effective in adults, we'll say, all right, let's try these in pediatrics if there's a benefit in those pediatric patients. And so we kind of go through this process again and then get a second approval for pediatrics. We're basically running right back through this whole thing again. So you may be adding years to the overall process to get a vaccine approved. Now, in the setting of COVID, what they've done is not necessarily take away any of these steps. It's really combining or condensing these steps and removing some of the red tape. So in the typical process, moving from that first to second to third phase requires a lot of red tape just to take that next step. Whereas here they've been able to streamline much of this process. So when it comes to selecting a target, they've taken what would normally be a company running one target. Does it work? No, move on to another target. Instead, they've incentivized a lot of companies to go out there. And so it's kind of the spaghetti theory, right? If you throw enough spaghetti against the wall, something's going to stick. And so they had enough stick up front that they can move these to phase 1 trials and really start to test the safety and efficacy, and then start to streamline those human trials to get things to market a little bit quicker. In the meantime, as opposed to waiting for the vaccine to be fully approved to start these manufacturing pipeline development, this was started at the very beginning. As soon as they identified that vaccine target, they started building manufacturing infrastructure. And so what would have taken additional years to get to, they're now ready, once they've shown a product to be safe and effective, to then immediately start distributing that vaccine. And so what would normally take 1 to 10 years is now trimmed down to months with all the same steps intact. And for the human trials, what would take 1 to 5 years is now trimmed down to less than a year, which is a pretty impressive feat, given that all of the safety and efficacy markers that we look for in trials were still present for these. And now we're at the point where we've shown the safety and efficacy in adults, and we're moving on to these pediatric trials. And so that's what we're here to talk about today, right? The pediatric aspect of this. And I think Dr. Julis will talk a little bit more about some of these results from the trials and how many patients were involved in those. But to date, there's been several thousand participants in these pediatric trials, many more when you include all of the COVID vaccines out there. And so that leads to a second question I often get, have enough people receive this vaccine for us to know if it truly is safe? So here I present for you the number of administered vaccines to date up to the 13th of May. So far worldwide, there's been 675 million participants or patients who have received at least 1 dose of the vaccine. Here in the US, it's 154 million. And in Maine itself, 660,000 folks who have received at least 1 dose. And out of those, across the world. 140 million of those have been the Pfizer. So while the original approval trials for the Pfizer, or authorization trials for the Pfizer vaccine, included about 44,000 patients, we now also have an additional 140 million patients for whom we have experience in the safety and efficacy. And so we've been able to take those trials and start to see how it looks in the real world. And we're much more informed about how safe and how effective the vaccines are at this point. And again, just to reiterate, it's important to understand that the COVID-19 vaccines are held to the same safety standards as we go through that approval process as any other vaccine that's been approved historically. So this is, I guess I'll present this piece of it. So the COVID vaccine from Pfizer has received now authorization under emergency use authorization from the FDA for individuals 12 years of age and older as of the 10th of May. And in that study, almost 2,300 kids in this age group of 12 to 15 have at least 2 months of follow-up for the second dose. We'll talk about in a second why that 2 months follow-up is important. But we also have now more than 6 months of data in that 16 plus population that was in the original trial. And that's thousands of patients more. The most common side effect that's been noted for Pfizer vaccine across both the original authorization trials, in this follow-up safety trials, and in the pediatric trials is pain at the site of injection, fatigue, headache, chills, muscle pain, fever, and joint pain, things that we would typically expect from a vaccine. And overall, the effectiveness has been phenomenal. In the pediatric trial, there were 16 cases recorded in the placebo group versus none in the vaccine group, which translates to a trial efficacy of 100%. Now that number may change a little bit as you see it in the real world, but either way, it demonstrates that this, again, is one of the most effective vaccines that we've had developed in the last 50 years. So what are the side effects? This really is the second most common question I get, both from a short-term standpoint and from a long-term standpoint. And so we'll touch a little bit on both of those. First, from the short-term standpoint, and when I say short-term, I mean the side effects you experience within 24 to 48 hours of receiving the vaccine. One thing to understand is that these are common regardless of what vaccine you receive. And these vaccines that are very good at stimulating the immune system, you're going to see very common set of side effects. Those are pain, redness, and swelling at the site of injection, as well as muscle pain, fatigue, headaches, chills, and fever. These are all signs that your immune system sees that antigen, is learning it, and developing a robust immune response to it to protect you in the case of future exposure to the virus. Now, in the adult trials and in the pediatric trials, similar rates of these were seen in both groups. And as with the adult trials, these are most commonly observed after dose 2. For reference sake, I've also included here in this chart the rates of the side effects I mentioned, not only in the Pfizer adult trial and in the Pfizer pediatric trial, but also in the trial for Shingrix, which is a shingles vaccine that's unique compared to the previous versions of the shingles vaccine, and that it has a part added to it that helps to really stimulate the immune system, so you get a very strong immune response. And you can see, again, the rates of side effects here are very similar for Shingrix as they were for the Pfizer trials. The second piece is the long-term side effects. And so when I'm talking about long-term side effects, I really mean things that happen outside of what you'd expect from this chart, things at the site of injection or that local reaction involving your initial immune response to the vaccine itself. And so long-term side effects, or what we call delayed side effects, are extremely rare. They can occur, and there's historical examples of these occurring, but they're extremely uncommon in vaccines as they're approved. And this is because vaccines have a very specific role. You inject with an antigen that the immune system can see and recognize, and then it activates your immune system and it learns how to look for that antigen again in the future. These antigens are often very rapidly degraded molecules. They don't stay in the system for very long. And the ingredients involved in the vaccine are typically things that you find in your normal body anyway, electrolytes and things that help to make it a slightly more tolerable injection. So when you take that into account, there's very little reason biologically to assume that most vaccines would cause any kind of long-term side effect, as most of the product of that vaccine is gone almost immediately. Now, these delayed vaccine side effects do occur, but in almost all cases, they occur within the first 2 months. And from a historical standpoint, I've listed here in this chart 5 examples of previous vaccines, which comprises almost the entirety of examples of delayed side effects for vaccines in previous vaccines, and what exactly those were. The ones that have demonstrated side effects have all occurred within the first 2 months, and in the most case were exceedingly rare. In fact, for the yellow fever vaccine, there was 2 serious delayed side effects involving the way that the live virus interacts with the brain that were identified, but it was so rare that it took 66 years from initial use of yellow fever to even identify that that was a side effect of the vaccine. In the case of the adenovirus COVID vaccine, which has certainly been a concern recently in the news, the rates of those cases there were 7 cases per 1 million from the initial studies or the initial reports. And again, this is an extraordinarily rare event. The 1976 influenza vaccine has been associated with an increased risk of a neuromuscular disease called Guillain-Barré. But notably, even in this setting, the influenza infection itself has a higher risk of developing Guillain-Barré than you would from receiving the vaccination itself. And the occurrence of this was particularly rare in those who received the vaccine as well. Again, in all 3 of these examples I just provided, all of these side effects occurred within the 2 months. And they had clear associations with aspects of the vaccine that they received. And so when it comes to the mRNA vaccines, from a biological standpoint, it's hard to find good reasons why we think that there could be a risk for delayed side effects. And certainly, you can never guarantee anything in science. There's always a chance anything could happen. When we look at these things, we say it's very unlikely, and we can find very few good reasons to be concerned about it. So when we talk about the examples that I just provided in the previous slide, we can look at the mRNA vaccine and see that, 1, it doesn't contain a live virus. It only contains mRNA, and its ingredients are naturally occurring ingredients, mostly electrolytes, things that you would find in sports drinks. mRNA itself is something that's naturally found in the body. You produce it in all of your cells every single day. It's a natural body process, so we're not introducing a foreign object. mRNA itself cannot interact with DNA. There's no biologic mechanism present for us to take that mRNA and put it inside the nucleus of our cells where DNA is housed and have an interaction there. So mRNA works entirely outside of the nucleus, which means it doesn't have any interaction with our DNA. The contents of the vaccine, including the mRNA, disappear entirely within a few hours and as long as a couple of days, but really no longer than that. The mRNA degrades rapidly, and the ingredients themselves are naturally occurring ingredients in the body, and so those simply become incorporated in the body, along with sodium, the electrolytes, with the electrolytes that are already in your body. And the immune response itself targets a very specific part of the virus. And we've seen no indication that that immune response has any risk of interacting with any other protein or part of your body. And so it works very specifically on the virus. Now, at 600 million doses of vaccines given worldwide, if there was an interaction with parts of your body other than the virus, you most likely would have seen this as an indicator appearing in the vaccinated population. So all of these together kind of leaves you with very little scientific plausibility for a risk for delayed side effects. And as we've moved further into this pandemic, we've continued to expand our experience with these vaccines. As I mentioned earlier, now we have quite a bit of follow-up, up to 6 months of follow-up in the adult patients who've received the vaccine, and see that these biological theories that we have here have held true, and that there have been no reports or no reports in the literature yet of concerning issues identified previously with the Pfizer vaccine. So with that, I am going to pass the mic back to Emily. And Dr. Jubilis, I just saw you popped on if you wanted to add anything else as well.
I think that is exactly right on. We have a lot of data. I think one of the things that is important to emphasize is that the CDC is continuously, there's something called the adverse event reporting system, and the CDC is continuously evaluating things that are reported, and we have months and reams of data now that suggest that these vaccines are safe. They are as well studied as any vaccine out there, and probably better studied than many of them. So so we feel very, very comfortable, and they're also extremely effective. The number of what we call breakthrough infections is extraordinarily rare. So with that, we do have some frequently asked questions that we're going to have Emily Poland pose to us, and we'll try to answer.
Yeah, so kind of writing the first question goes right kind of what you just said was about the vaccine being rushed. So do we really, was it rushed? Is it still experimental? Can you I know you talked about it a little bit. I think Dr. Massey did, but
Yeah, it's a great question. And when we go back, I can show in those slides, that all of the steps that we'd expect to be there for approving and authorizing a vaccine were still present with these vaccines. I think one other piece I can add to that is if you go back and look at most of the other vaccines out there, influenza vaccines, pneumococcal vaccines, Haemophilus influenza vaccine that we give for pediatrics, prevent Haemophilus influenza infections. All of these, the number of patients that they enroll is not dissimilar from the number of patients that we enrolled for these vaccines, for the Pfizer vaccine, Moderna vaccine, et cetera. And it's because we're following the same FDA guidance that was used for the approval of previous vaccines. So most of the vaccines that we utilize today underwent the same number of patients, the same timeline of follow-up, the same study procedures as the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. So yeah, it's on an abbreviated timeline, which is an amazing feat, but I wouldn't call it rushed.
And to second that, I think something important to consider for the pediatric dosing in particular, Dr. Massey mentioned that we trial in adults and then we work our way down to kids. And that's true for almost any medication out there. And so one of the things that we've benefited from in pediatrics is that with Moderna, it's been 18 and up, with Pfizer, it's been 16 and up. And so if it works in a 16-year-old and it's safe in a 16-year-old, and we've given hundreds of thousands of doses in 16 and 17-year-olds, there's no reason to think it won't be safe in a 15-year-old, which means there's no reason to think it won't be safe in a 14-year-old. And so we call it, age down regulation, like kind of looking at it in lowering subsequent lowering age groups. And that's why it went from 16 and up down to now 12 and up. And then the next step will be down into the younger kids. And we work very hard to make sure it's safe in those older kids. And there's no reason to think it'll be different in the younger kids when we start trialing in that group.
So will the vaccine change my genes, or not my genes, but my child's genes if they get the vaccine?
So like Dr. Massey was saying, there's really, your cells make DNA, or have DNA, which encodes your hair color and your eye color and everything else. And then RNA, which RNA uses DNA to kind of make all of those things, everything your body needs. So RNA is kind of your blueprint, your pattern. RNA functions in one part of the cell, DNA functions in a different part of the cell, and RNA actually needs like a key to go into the nucleus where the DNA is. And this RNA in the Pfizer vaccine does not have that key. There is absolutely no way for it to cross into the nucleus and interact with your DNA, as Dr. Massey was saying earlier.
Thank you. Can you talk about teenagers? Would it affect the menstrual cycles of teen girls?
So that is something that has definitely popped up in the news. And so I mentioned the adverse reporting system. So anytime there's a vaccine given, there's the vaccine adverse event reporting system that if there's anything that you're at all concerned about, your physician or the vaccine recipient can report it to the CDC. And we have collected hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of reports, and it's can be anything. So there have been, some what we call anecdotal reports of adult women experiencing some heavy bleeding after the COVID vaccine, after the Pfizer vaccine. However, it's not been enough that we can say it's because of the Pfizer vaccine. It's actually, there's so many things that can do that we really can't link the two. So there is a certain component of what we call recall bias with this. So people are paying attention to things and they might notice things a little bit more. And so they're more inclined to report something, whether or not it's related. Even if it were to be related, on the very, very rare chance it's related, it's something that's very short-lived, seems to last through just one cycle, if it happens at all. And as I mentioned, we really don't have any reason to link it to the vaccine.
What about the strokes that we've heard about on the news?
So yes, I think Dr. Massey mentioned those in context of the adenovirus vaccine, which is more commonly known as the Johnson & Johnson. And then they've also noticed this with AstraZeneca, which has been given in Europe. And they're extraordinarily rare, 6 cases in millions of doses. And to me, the pause that was given on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is just a sign that our safety surveillance is working. We paused with just a few cases reported of this. We investigated it. And we did issue the CDC issued some warnings, that maybe in women, it seems to be mostly in women at the age range of 20 to 50. Within the first few weeks, physicians should know to look out for these things, and then you could consider getting another vaccine potentially. Which brings me to the second point, which is that this seems to be something that's specific to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It's not been noticed at all with Pfizer or with Moderna, the two mRNA vaccines, and we have no reason to think that it will occur with those.
And just to be clear, for the 16 or the 12 to 15 and population, the only vaccine that is available for those people right now in the United States is the Pfizer.
Exactly.
Are there other side effects that we should be worried about, others than what you already mentioned?
So the biggest side effect are exactly what Dr. Massey mentioned. It's fever. That affects really about 1 in 7 is what we have noticed in our vaccinations of healthcare workers and of adults. Goes away within 24 to 48 hours. We pain in the arm pain. That's really kind of the biggest one. It does, younger people do sometimes report more side effects than older people. And these are not really what I would call side effects. It's more kind of just proving that it's working. Your body is learning how to fight this infection. Some people report this with the flu shot every year. It doesn't mean you got the flu from the flu shot. It just means that your body has learned what the flu looks like. Your immune system, which is the part of your body that makes the fever and all of that, has learned what it's supposed to do. So those are the biggest side effects. One of the things that is constantly brought up as a concern, I think kind of in the pop press, is concerns about fertility. And especially when you hear RNA, DNA, those sorts of things, I think that kind of feeds into that. There has never been a case where a vaccine has affected fertility. And because of the way these vaccines work, we have no reason to think that it would affect fertility long-term here at all. As Dr. Massey mentioned, the RNA degrades very, very quickly. That's why you have to keep these vaccines so cold, because it doesn't last long. There's no way for it to interact with your DNA. It does not have the key that allows it to get into the DNA. So it cannot interact with your DNA, with your genetic material at all. There was concern raised that at one point in some of the pop press that it could interact with the placenta and things along those lines. And there has never been any documented evidence that occurs. In fact, now we have data in a significant number of pregnant women that it is safe, and there's not been significantly increased miscarriages or problems in those women.
Yeah, and I think an interesting point to add there to what Dr. Jubilis is saying, the vaccine immunity that it provokes, the antibodies that it creates, is the same antibodies you would get with natural infection if you were infected with COVID. It's the same exact ones, target the same exact things in the virus. So if there was a concern that these antibodies interacted with placental proteins, or there was any interaction with reproductive systems, we would anticipate we'd see this in the general population who's been infected as well, with hundreds of millions of cases of COVID. And that's simply not been reported or identified. And as Dr. Jubilis mentioned, quite a few pregnancies have been followed closely since vaccination with so far healthy outcomes.
Do we know how long the immunity is going to last?
That's a very good question, and I think we're still learning about that, especially with the variants as they emerge. We do have data now for 6 months from when we started the trials in adults, and it seems to be at least 6 months. We know with natural infection, it seems to be at least 8 months, 8 to 10 months, and so there's no reason to think that this would be less. It might be more. And there is a chance that this is going to be like the flu vaccine, and we're going to have to get boosters at periodic intervals, but we just don't know that yet. And so the trial participants are actually being followed for 2 years, and part of what they're being followed for is how their antibodies do, how their immune system does, and how long it lasts.
And does it provide protection against the other strains? You mentioned that in your answer, mentioned the other strains for in the past 6 months, but do we know that we have protection against like what's going on in India, for example?
Yeah, I can provide a little insight here. And so, yes, so we've all heard of these different variants that are popping up, and there's a lot of numbers and letters associated, and specifically the B1351 and B117 and the P1 strains are the ones that we've been most concerned about. And the reason we're concerned about them is because either they have a higher rate of infectivity or they have a higher rate of poor outcomes if you're infected with those. And the mutations that cause these strains to emerge mostly revolve around or include changes to the spike protein, which is the antibody target that's being formed when we get the COVID vaccine. So there's been an intrinsic concern since the beginning about whether or not this will affect vaccine immunity. And so we've had some great laboratory work to look at if we take serum from somebody who's been vaccinated and put live virus in there, do we see the same level of what we call neutralization, which means basically virus killing, in the strain, the new variants versus the original strain of COVID? And you've probably heard in the news that, yes, with some of the vaccines, with most of the vaccines, there's some decrease in the overall, what they call neutralization of the variant vaccines when exposed to the serum of vaccinated individuals. But something that's really important to understand and kind of a tough concept to follow is that the degree of neutralization doesn't necessarily translate from the laboratory into real world and mean that it's any less effective at protecting you from the vaccine. So we use a term called correlate of immunity when it comes to vaccinations. And that means that we've set some level that we'll look for with antibodies or some other lab test for immunity, that we say, if you have more than this, you're very likely protected. If you have less than this, you're less likely protected. For the COVID vaccines, for SARS-CoV-2, we haven't established a correlate of immunity. We don't know if there's a specific level of antibodies that you're no longer protected. But what we do know is that in the environments where these variants have been very active, particularly the B1351 in the Middle East and in South Africa, from the vaccines that have trialed their vaccines in those areas, as well as reports from these countries after initiating their vaccine campaigns, their vaccines seem to remain, continue to have a significant degree of protection. In fact, a study that recently came from Qatar looked at exactly this, where the B1351 vaccine was very prevalent, and the overall vaccine efficacy was greater than 75% for symptomatic COVID, but still 100% effective for preventing severe COVID hospitalization and death. So even if people had a few more breakthrough infections, it wasn't to a significant degree that the vaccine no longer works, and you were still protected from the very severe outcomes. Now, many in the public may have heard that some of the companies like Moderna are exploring alterations to their vaccine strain to better target these variants. And that doesn't mean that their vaccine's not working against it. It's actually one of the beauties of this technology, this mRNA technology, whereas historically we would have to go through a very long process of identifying a new target, running it through cultures of virus, creating something that will grow well in the body and reproduce in the body and create a vaccine. We now have this mRNA, which is very simple in a laboratory to slightly adjust to target a different protein on the virus. So companies like Moderna and Pfizer can say, oh, we have a new variant. And if it does impact the efficacy of the vaccine, it's very quick and easy for them to make a new mRNA that would target these new variants and then produce that and roll that out worldwide. So whether or not we'll need booster shots in the future, not totally clear yet. We may very well, but because we have these new technologies and new vaccines that have come out, the ability of us to create those booster shots and respond to them when that does become a necessity is much easier. But as of today, it appears that the Pfizer vaccine, both from the trials and from real world experience, continues to be effective in protecting patients who receive the Pfizer vaccine, even in the setting of these variants.
Thank you. And the last question I have is there a reason I should not have my child vaccinated? Like if my child has a chronic condition, are there contraindications for getting the vaccine?
So the biggest contraindication is a significant history of allergy to something that's in the vaccine. So that would be things like the most common one is something called polyethylene glycol, which is Miralax. And that's also something that's found in cosmetics and makeup and different things like that. So if you have had a history of anaphylaxis, which is where your throat swells up, your lips swell up, you have difficulty breathing, that would potentially be a contraindication and might be a reason to wait until one of the non-mRNA vaccines make it to market for this age group. That's really the only contraindication. There are other allergies that, so we watch all patients who receive the Pfizer vaccine. We watch them for 15 minutes after, just to make sure there's no allergy reaction. A subset of patients who have a history of severe allergy, anaphylaxis to medications, and things like that. Again, anaphylaxis is not diarrhea, it's not things like that, it's, you know, severe throat swelling and not able to breathe. Those patients will watch for 30 minutes. And we have given thousands of vaccine now and have not had really any instances where we have to worry about that, but we do continue to watch those patients for 30 minutes just to be on the safe side. So, so just, you know, so that's not a contraindication, but it's just something to be aware of. The other question that I get a lot is about immune suppressed patients. So these are patients who might be receiving chemotherapy for cancer or have some sort of autoimmune disease like Crohn's disease or inflammatory bowel disease or rheumatoid arthritis, where they're taking medications that suppress their immune system. And because this is not a live virus vaccine, so live virus vaccines are things like the measles vaccine, where we do worry with immune suppressed patients that they could get a form of the virus because it's alive. This is not that. So we don't worry about that with those patients. There's no reason to think they're going to have significant side effects. What we don't know is how well it's going to work. Those patients were not really included in great numbers in these clinical trials, either on the adult side or the pediatric side. So there are thoughts that they may not mount as much of an immune response, but they probably amount some immune response, and some is better than none. So we still recommend giving it. They're safe, and they appear to be safe in this population, and they appear to have some effectivity, and we know that those populations are at increased risk of bad outcomes with COVID. And so even a little bit of effectiveness is better than none.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jubilis and Dr. Massey. Do either of you have anything else you want to add? I think that we've gone through our questions, and I think this was really helpful.
Thank you, Emily, so much for having us here. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about the vaccines. You know, I think if I'm going to add one more thing, you know, I think it's safe to share that certainly practice what you preach. You know, for me, I have children and I plan to vaccinate my kids as soon as they're eligible.
And I second what Dr. Massey says. I think it's important for people to look at what your physicians are doing. You know, we all lined up. I mean, we were beating down the door to get this vaccine as soon as it was available for us. And I think every physician I know is beating down the door to get the vaccine for their child as soon as it's available for them. And if you look at the clinical trials, it's again, a lot of physicians and healthcare workers have enrolled their children in these clinical trials. So we all feel very strongly that this is safe, that this is effective. And you know, this is our path out of this. This is our exit ramp. This is the way we end this pandemic. And it's up to all of us to do our part. So thank you for having us, Emily.
You're welcome. And I just want to add one other piece of information for those that are in the school. One of the other benefits, besides being protected against severe illness and hospitalization, one of the other benefits of being vaccinated is if there is a positive case of COVID in your school and you're identified as a close contact. So if you're fully vaccinated or your child is fully vaccinated, they won't have to quarantine. They can continue to attend school. So it's another piece of that puzzle of getting everybody back in school full time. So thank you so much for joining me today. And I hope that this is helpful for many, many people in our state to spread the word of the safety of the COVID vaccine. So thanks. Thank you.